Welcome to The Bottom Line, where we unpack some of the main business and economic stories of the day. Donald Trump will become the 47th president of the United States in less than an hour. Here in Central and Eastern Europe, there has been a certain sense of foreboding since Donald Trump's election victory. And as we've seen earlier on in the show, economists are concerned by the potential impact. Today, we are joined by Raffaella Tenconi, chief economist at Wood & Co., to share her analysis on what we might expect in this part of the world following Trump's inauguration. Hello, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, I'm delighted to be on the show. Thank you.
So let's begin with tariff war, something that is a source of great concern here in Central and Eastern Europe. Do you anticipate that actual wars between Europe and the US will start, and perhaps whether excessive protectionist trade policies would even be of benefit to the US and Central and Eastern relations? We hear that up to perhaps 0.2 percentage points of GDP might be shaved off for Hungary. Obviously, Hungary is in a very difficult economic situation at the moment.
Well, I am not sure necessarily I would call it a war, but yes, we do know that incoming President Trump wants to use tariffs. We do know he wants to put some tariffs on EU goods, and the EU is perhaps on the weaker end of some of his targets. So we do expect that there will be tariffs. And at that point, the EU will have to retaliate. So yes, there will be at least one round of tariffs on both ends, which creates disruptions and differences in cost. As you pointed out, that there will be cost in terms of GDP, and I agree. We actually reduced our projections, not only for Hungary, but all of Central Europe by 0.5 percentage points this year, purely on probable tariff disruptions.
That is quite a significant amount. I wanted to also ask you about defense, because obviously defense costs for each country, and perhaps a little bit of a focus on Poland. Generally speaking, Poland has enjoyed a rather positive relationship with the US, and it also has led on NATO defense. Do you think that the two countries can perhaps mold a relationship out of what they share to both of their benefits, and perhaps develop a positive relationship from here onwards, perhaps on behalf of the region?
Well, look, I think one issue is Trump specifically has said that he likes tariffs, and he does want to introduce tariffs on most of its trading partners. So that is a given. That is a starting point. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship between the EU and the US will be negative and self-destructive on all fronts. As you said, on defense, definitely there is cooperation. I mean, he is pushing for higher defense spending. Poland is definitely at the forefront in the EU on that. And higher defense spending is in any case in the interest of the EU because of Russia. But also when you look at it in terms of industrial changes, we do know that the car industry is going to go through significant consolidation in the next few years. So broadening defense actually is an advantageous strategic decision for the EU, also from an industrial perspective. So I wouldn't necessarily say that Trump is all negative or it's going to be all war, but Trump sets the agenda. And I would say what perhaps is most important for Europe, it sets the tempo.
Donald Trump has spoken very openly. I'm just going to carry on with this defense thread for a little bit. He's been very open about his demands in regards to defense spending in NATO, and this concerns all the countries, obviously. And in a bid to appease him, do you think the European countries might feel pressured to disregard their domestic expenditure priorities in an attempt to focus to ensure that they have a degree of negotiating power, perhaps by buying arms from the US as a means to perhaps avoid tariff wars?
I mean, so far, it's not that we necessarily see that, because increasing defense spending is something that the member states, by and large, have already agreed. We already know that the core...
But not to the extent that Trump would like, perhaps.
Not to the extent that Trump would like, absolutely. And this is definitely a difficult point. we do know that all of them agree on the restructuring of defense in Europe, because it's not just the capex. So it's not just about buying items. It's also how you will produce it, how you'll share the knowledge, how you coordinate so that you don't double things. So defense is a broad spectrum, and we do know that in terms of strategic decisions, there is already a lot of alignment. But for example, it's not that we saw any new announcement at the December EU Council. So if you wanted to move ahead of Trump and try to gain some leverage, that would have been the right time to do it, and we didn't see it. So it appears to me that the EU will definitely have to increase defense spending anyway. Will probably have to please Trump on a variety of issues and probably concede certain things so that the tariff barrier is not as high as it would be. But unfortunately, it doesn't look like to me they are moving first, so to speak.
Trump has assured a quick end to the war in Ukraine, but to this day, no one is entirely clear on how this will happen. So assuming that U.S. support for Ukraine wanes or drops to some extent, what does this actually mean financially for European countries, especially in this part of Europe, for the Baltic states, in terms of stepping up support? Because obviously this is more of a financial burden for us.
Well, you ask a difficult question. I mean, in theory, the EU has pledged almost unlimited support to Ukraine, in the sense that it has pledged support regardless of what are the conditions. Europe is trying to have its own internal debate on what really are the priorities. What I mean by that is that if you look at the fiscal rules, in reality, the fiscal rules already give all of the member states a lot of flexibility to increase, for example, defense spending or to do other things, okay? But in reality, what you see is that most member states are still too heavily focused on the short term, on how much fiscal consolidation they need to do, without really having a honest debate on what are really the priorities. Because it's not just defense, it's defense. What are you going to invest in human capital? What are you going to invest in the green transition or just infrastructure? So I think what I mean by when I said Trump sets the tempo is that Trump is forcing the EU to take decisions the EU needs to take anyway, very rapidly. And the speed is something, in any case, the EU is not particularly good at. And in this particular moment is having a really hard time coming to terms with the right reaction. So unfortunately, I think the EU is somewhat weak in its own political economic stance right now.
And moving on to some other issues, the relationship between big tech and the 47th US president has entered a new era, which is an entirely different topic on its own. But this brings on a new plane of friction between the US and Europe. The EU has a slightly different approach in terms of regulation than the US. What are your thoughts about what is to come in this new chapter?
Yeah, definitely the US will, wants to win the tech evolution. What I mean by that is in terms of wants to be at the forefront in terms of regulation or deregulation, wants to be ahead in investment because, as you know, artificial intelligence and generally digital technologies will require increasing amount of energy in order to be optimized over long term. So he wants to be also very attractive and competitive in terms of data capacity. And also is ready to put competition consideration in the background in order to facilitate this transition. I think in the EU there is an acknowledgement that some of the competition rules need to be changed. When I say acknowledgement, if you read the Draghi report, it's clear that there is a recommendation to undo some of the competition regulations, but I'm not sure necessarily the EU will change completely its stance. The EU really and EU voters tend to support data protection.
Oh, there's a bit of a tech problem there.
So I think... You still there?
Yeah, I'm still there. Are you there?
Okay, perfect. Sorry. So I think that the EU will just try to do its best to keep up. But in terms of digital, will not be able to do very much. But may I change a little bit your perspective on this topic? Because everything you've mentioned so far, which is absolutely correct and urgent, is where Trump is strong. Where Trump is weak and will be weaker is on cost of borrowing. Because as you already can see in the markets, the yields, so the borrowing cost of US state and US companies has been rising on the expectation that there will be more fiscal loosening and more growth spur. Interest rates will rise further. So the edge of Europe at this stage is on the cost of funding, and you will see that growing over time.
Okay, Raffaella, we're going to wrap it up there. It's great to have your insight on a day like this.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us. And we were joined by Raffaella Tenconi, Chief Economist at Wood & Co. Thanks so much for joining us today. I was your host, Marie Cato. Join us every weekday for Business Arena at 5 p.m. CET on TVP World. And for the latest in regional business, follow us on X and on tvpworld.com. And for more news and features, stay with us on TVP World. Goodbye.